It was July of 1989. In Kyoto, rumors persisted at Nintendo headquarters about how their biggest competitor, Sega, was just about to release a 16-bit console in North America. Even though Sega's own 8-bit Master System was technically more powerful than either the Famicom or NES, Nintendo had pretty much ignored Sega for the most part. But by the end of the summer of 1989, Sega could no longer be ignored. They were actively and openly challenging Nintendo for the crown of home console dominance. But during the same time, out of nowhere, one of Nintendo's biggest third-party developers, Hudson Soft, had teamed up with someone who was determined to tackle Nintendo and take over the video game industry. In 1973, brothers Yoshi and Hiroshi Kudo opened an amateur radio shop called CQ Hudson in Sapporo, Japan. What began as an amateur radio shop soon grew, and by 1975 was selling personal computer-related products. By 1978, they were developing and selling video game-related packages for those same computers. In 1970s Japan, it was not uncommon for amateur radio shops like CQ Hudson to begin switching their business model to incorporate the growing trend of personal computers. But instead of producing a better quality product, Yoshi and Hiroshi took the mantra of quantity over quality. By 1983, the brothers were producing up to 30 different game titles per month. By this time, however, Yoshi and Hiroshi switched business tactics in an effort to secure a lucrative deal with Nintendo and the just-released Famicom console. Hudson Soft became Nintendo's first third-party developer, and after shifting focus on the quality of the game over quantity this time, their 1984 Famicom release titled Lode Runner ended up selling 1.2 million copies. In 1985, Hudson Soft ported their successful PC hit Bomberman over to the Famicom as well. By this time, Hudson Soft had already upgraded to additional offices in Tokyo. The brothers Kudo and their young company were happy with their early success and felt confident enough to approach Nintendo with designs for an advanced graphics chip. Their intention was to not only build gaming titles as a third-party developer, but also to build additional gaming consoles as well. The C62 system was the prototype they had wanted to wow Nintendo with. The name C62 was a homage back to the brothers' youth and their obsession with trains. The C62 class of trains were the largest and fastest steam locomotives in Japan. The C62s in Japan were classified under a 464 type of classification. This refers to a train comprised of 4 leading wheels, 6 powered and coupled driving wheels, and 4 trailing wheels. These types of trains were given the moniker Hudson, after the Hudson River in New York. The C62 prototype gaming system Hudson Soft developed was intended to be the fastest and most powerful on the market, and they wanted to partner with Nintendo to bring their prototype to fruition. This prototype was pushed as what Nintendo's next generation console could be. At this time, Nintendo had already begun investing in a disc add-on for the Famicom. The Famicom Disk System was released in February of 1986 and was intended to be an upgrade for their Famicom console until their next generation console had actually been developed and released. The disk system itself allowed for more memory to be used in the game, as well as incorporating better quality sound. When the disk system worked, it provided a better quality experience with the Famicom. That is, when it worked. The disk system was riddled with errors from day one. The disks themselves easily got damaged, which corrupted its data. One cost-cutting measure that definitely appealed to most consumers was the ability to buy blank discs for 2,000 yen a piece and have a game of your choice written on it for only 500 yen. Compared to the 5,000 yen consumers would spend on a manufactured game, this certainly gave consumers the best bang for their yen. These kiosks popped up everywhere in Japan and were still being used until Nintendo discontinued them in 1993. Part of their popularity grew in part to being able to reuse an already purchased disc and write a new game over the old one for the same 500 yen. While the concept was certainly brilliant, the execution failed miserably. One reason it had great potential was, unlike in the United States, the practice of renting out games was strictly illegal in Japan. Throughout the 1980s, video rental stores started popping up all across the US. It didn't take long for rental stores to incorporate video game rentals into their inventory. This was a common scene in rental stores throughout the 1980s and 90s.
1 second. I'm on the phone with the distribution house now. Let me make sure they got it. Okay. What's it called again?
Happy Scrappy Hero Pup.
Happy Scrappy.
She loves it.
Obviously. Yeah, hi, this is RST Video calling. Customer number 4352. I'd like to place an order. Okay, I need one each of the following tapes. Whispers in the Wind, To Each His Own, Put It Where It Doesn't Belong, My Pipes Need Cleaning, Volume 8, I Need Your Worshipping Rim Gargling Naked Buns 3, in Socks, Eileen, Huge Black Girls Who Crave Metalone 2, The KY Connection, Pink oh yeah, and All Holes Filled with Hard Yep. Oh, wait a minute, what was that called again?
Originally, companies like Nintendo strongly resisted stores from stocking their shelves with games. And by strongly resisted, I mean they sued the crap out of them. Unfortunately for Nintendo, they lost, and video game rental stores were legally allowed to rent games as well as VHS tapes. But in Japan, game rentals were still illegal. So, services like the one offered by Nintendo's kiosks certainly appealed to consumers. One of the few positives that came out of the disc system was the implementation of a battery backup system incorporated into traditional Famicom and NES cartridges. Without it, games such as The Legend of Zelda wouldn't have been as appealing to consumers. The concept of save states only came about after games got more complex and took longer to complete. When the earlier arcade games were first being developed, the business model that appealed to bar and restaurant owners incorporated the patrons continually feeding quarters into the machine. These games were not intended to be complex, let alone require what we would call save states. When video games eventually came into our homes, that business model of pumping quarters into them no longer applied. Over the years, that idea of the player having a finite number of lives or continues has also faded away into memory. I mean, can you imagine how much fun completing a game like Halo or Black Ops would be if you were only given 3 continues? While Hudson Soft was a business whose goal was to make money, they were also not afraid to adapt with the changing times. Part of these various adaptations were in response to not wanting to lose money or consumers. If any company in Japan could brag about both success and of having their fingers on the pulse of Japan's consumers, it would be Hudson Soft. One method that ensured this was by touring Japan and hosting various competitions they called caravans. Starting in 1985 and running through 1992, these caravans gave everyday players an opportunity to showcase their talents as gamers. These same caravans also served as the perfect marketing tool for Hudson Soft. The success these caravans brought Hudson Soft, on top of being the top third-party developer for Nintendo, no doubt left an impression with the brothers Kudo that they thought they could race past the ashes of Sega and challenge Nintendo for the throne. Hudson Soft had proposed a number of prospective advanced graphics chips plans that were intended to be used in the next generation console for Nintendo. While Nintendo had been satisfied with using Hudson Soft as a third-party developer for their games, they had no interest at all in utilizing them, or any third party for that matter, in designing and developing what would be the Super Famicom. It was after these rejections, however, that Hudson Soft would be approached by one of Japan's top computer manufacturers. At this time in the mid-1980s, NEC was a computer manufacturer that had their hands in numerous areas of international telecommunications. They built supercomputers that by the 1990s were considered to be the fastest in the world, literally. They made meteorological space satellites, telephone systems for AT&T, and even personal computers. They were also, at this time in the mid-1980s, fighting to keep the Brazilian military from taking control of their government contracts for their subsidiaries there. Relax, I'm not going to dive into that mess of a Schwarzenegger movie. With all that being said, NEC was always on the lookout for the next big thing in tech. And when NEC discovered Hudson Soft was approaching numerous tech companies about forming a partnership to manufacture a competing gaming console to Nintendo and Sega, they welcomed them to the negotiating table. Because of their reputation as a third-party developer, and with the recent success of their inaugural Caravan tour, NEC felt that Hudson Soft fared the best chance to take on both Nintendo and Sega. So, in 1986, a partnership was formed, and on October 30th, 1987, the PC Engine was released in Japan. The PC Engine is considered the first 16-bit gaming console, a distinction that has caused more than a few schoolyard debates. The reasoning behind these debates has to do with the hardware NEC and Hudson Soft used in the PC Engine. Kids in the schoolyard claimed the PC Engine wasn't actually a 16-bit console, while others claimed it was. But where did this discrepancy even come from anyway? From a technical perspective, the PC Engine only used an 8-bit CPU, but it did actually have a 16-bit GPU installed too. So, what does that even mean to the layman? First off, the terms 8-bit and 16-bit are not actual technical terms used by anyone who builds or works on these things. 8-bit and 16-bit are strictly marketing terms used in advertising and have no actual meaning from a technical perspective. But the terms that do carry weight have to do with the CPU and the GPU. The CPU, or Central Processing Unit, was the HUC 6280. This was part of the 6502 family of microprocessors that earlier consoles used as well. The GPU, or Graphics Processing Unit, was a chip that held 8 kilobytes of work RAM and 64 kilobytes of video RAM. So, while the CPU is from the 8-bit classic consoles, the graphics were actually processed with a more advanced chipset. So, does this make the PC Engine 8-bit or 16-bit? In my opinion, I would classify it as 16-bit because of the GPU. The reasoning for this, from my perspective, has to do with how the graphics are displayed. Like I mentioned a moment ago, the terms 8-bit and 16-bit don't actually carry any real weight, other than from a marketing perspective. So it kinda doesn't really matter whether you classify any console as 8-bit or 16-bit. While many debated the 16-bit legitimacy of the PC Engine, one console that no one disputed was 16-bit originated from Nintendo's biggest competitor, Sega. Despite making more mistakes than the average failed company, and somehow still managing to climb the ropes to suffer another knockout punch, Sega was far from throwing in the towel and conceding to Nintendo or anyone for that matter. Sega loved outdoing Nintendo in both their quality products and bigger failures. While Nintendo incorporated only one failed add-on to its Famicom console, Sega decided to reach for the stars and release not one, not two, not three, but 4 add-ons. With each of these add-ons requiring their own dedicated power supply, Clark Griswold wasn't the only one hoarding all the power in his neighborhood at the time. And this print advertisement from Sega themselves pretty much speaks for itself. In that regard, I think I need an adult.
You ever been in a cockpit before?
No, sir, I've never been up in a plane before.
You ever seen a grown man naked?
Masahime Ishikawa was who Sega had tasked with leading the team that would develop Sega's next generation console. Sega's third generation console, the SG-1000, known better as the Master System in North America, used more advanced technology than their main competitor, Nintendo. While designing and building their 4th generation console, that philosophy of using more advanced hardware continued for Sega. Throughout the 1970s and continuing throughout the 1980s, Sega made a name for itself as an arcade manufacturer. The arcade cabinets Sega developed were impressive. Really impressive. Sega had both access and experience to more sophisticated hardware compared to their competitors, and Sega wanted to emphasize this by marketing their new console as the Mega Drive. The 16-bit console used two CPUs, the Motorola 68000 as the primary CPU and the Z80 as a secondary chipset. The secondary CPU allowed the primary CPU to process graphics more efficiently. This multi-CPU board design was already standard in their arcade cabinets. Sega planned to release their new Mega Drive in Japan on October 29, 1988. And doing a side-by-side comparison of the Mega Drive to any other home console at the time, it blew the competition out of the water. Well, at least on paper it did. One thing Sega still failed to realize was even if your product is technologically superior on paper, none of that even matters if you're not appealing to consumers with games they want to play. 1 week before Sega released the Mega Drive, Nintendo dominated the headlines by releasing Super Mario Bros. 3. This game was an instant phenomenon and would end up being one of the best-selling games of all time across any console. It was around this time that fate would change the course Sega would take to really give Nintendo a run for their money. When Nintendo released their Famicom and NES consoles, they lucked out with Super Mario Bros., a game that quickly became their standard pack-in game for the console. Throughout the late 1980s and continuing through the 1990s, Mario and his brother Luigi became the face of Nintendo. They were likable, family-friendly, and fun for both kids and adults. But Sega in general had no comparable mascot. When they released the Mega Drive in October of 1988, the console came with the option of two pack-in games, Space Harrier 2 and Super Thunderblade? Yeah, they weren't exactly the kinds of games that sounded as appealing as Mario. Sega realized to successfully take on Nintendo, they would have to branch outside of Japan, so they set their eyes on both Europe and North America. When it came to North America, Sega wanted to utilize experienced game makers who already knew the terrain, even if those same people had failed there themselves. By 1988, the company formerly known as Atari had broken off into two separate companies, one named Atari Corporation and the other Atari Games. In earlier episodes, I covered Atari Games and Atari Corporation, and in episode 14, I mistakenly referred to Atari Corporation as turning into Tengen. That was obviously a big brain fart on my part. While both companies had originated from the same Atari company and were both using the Atari branding in their company names, they were two completely separate legal entities. The home console side of Atari had been bought by Jack Tramiel, who renamed it Atari Corporation, but he had no interest in the coin-operated side of Atari. That part would develop into a new company formed by Atari's own former employees, who named it Atari Games. Both companies used Atari in their branding. However, a specific clause in the contract gave Jack Tramiel the sole right to use the Atari branding in any and all home console products. In order to develop games for Nintendo, Atari Games used the name Tengen. When Sega got serious about competing against Nintendo in North America, talks began between them and Jack Tramiel. Tramiel was not interested in working with Sega, citing the Mega Drive's high manufacturing cost, but Michael Katz was interested. Katz was the president of Atari Corporation's Entertainment Electronics division and had spent the late 1970s at Mattel and the early 80s at Coleco, being an eyewitness to the rise and fall of both the ColecoVision and Mattel's Intellivision. After Jack Tramiel turned down Sega's offer to collaborate, Michael Katz left Atari Corporation and joined Sega as the president of their North American division, with the intention of making the Mega Drive the standard home console there. Katz approached his new role with a strategy to beat Nintendo at their own game. Marketing and branding laid the foundation for what he hoped would be success in North America. Katz knew that what worked in Japan wouldn't necessarily work with Western consumers. Sega was actually unable to market their new system in North America as the Mega Drive. Ironically, it was because a computer company formed in 1988 had already acquired and secured the rights to the name Mega Drive. Sega ultimately settled on calling the North American system Genesis. A January 1989 release date had initially been set back in 1987. However, they were forced to move back the release date to late summer of '89, with New York and Los Angeles selling the first units on August 14th, and retailers in the rest of North America pushing their first units on September 15th with a $190 price tag. By the time the Genesis was first available to consumers, Nintendo was experiencing their best year to date. They had just released their mobile system, the Game Boy, and the hit Soviet game Tetris was taking the country by storm. Not to mention, the not yet released Power Glove and Super Mario Bros. 3 were already being marketed and were becoming highly anticipated to be huge successes. All this easily contributed to Nintendo controlling 95% of the home gaming market. Michael Katz and Sega had an uphill battle if they were even going to make a dent in Nintendo's dominance. In order to start even making a dent, Katz wanted Sega to use a sledgehammer against their rival, figuratively speaking. One tactic Katz had utilized at Coleco was implementing an aggressive marketing campaign. You could almost say the Genesis was going to be remembered by a marketing campaign of biblical proportions against the Goliath that was Nintendo. This notable print ad was a not very subtle taunt at Nintendo that just said, Genesis does what Nintendo don't.
No, don't do that. Don't do that. If you shoot him, you'll just make him mad.
But Nintendo was not fazed one bit. Back across the Pacific, the Japanese side of Sega was not amused at Katz's marketing strategy. They viewed it as too aggressive. Katz justified it as not only necessary, but also as a standard American practice. Sega of America's marketing director Al Nielsen justified the ad as well, reminding Sega of Japan that Nintendo was spending 10 times as much money in their marketing, and they didn't even have a real competitor. Katz and his small but dedicated American team realized Nintendo had a lock on younger gamers, most of whom were also boys. Katz wanted to start targeting those that Nintendo wasn't really catering to. This included teenagers, young adults, and even girls. Katz began making offers to various world-famous athletes and celebrities, in an effort to capitalize on using their names and images in future games. But Michael Katz had barely broken in his chair as president when Sega of Japan decided that 2 years were long enough for his leadership. Citing poor sales of the Genesis, Katz was removed as president of Sega of America in January of 1991. To replace Katz, Sega brought in Tom Kalinske. Kalinske had been president of Mattel in the early 80s, but if Sega thought Kalinske was going to take a more passive approach in competing with Nintendo than Katz had implemented, they would quickly realize that was not going to be the case. If anything, Kalinske would show that Katz hadn't gone far enough with the marketing campaign he'd started. But Kalinske did more than just examine what Nintendo was doing wrong. He also took note of what they were doing right. Kalinske had learned at Mattel the key to selling a successful toy was developing a backstory for it. After all, how do you think He-Man became such a big hit?
People don't want to buy video games starring an only child. How about a brother? You got a brother? You do now. Meet Luigi.
It is an absolute honor to have this opportunity.
He sounds nothing alike me.
I'm a Luigi.
Oh, the guy's a total pro. He can turn on the Italian like an embarrassing dad at the Olive Garden.
You told me to hide my ethnicity. I changed my name to Jumpman, for Christ's sake.
What's your real name again?
Mario.
I love it. Change it back. Italians are super hot right now, and you lose 30 pounds and grow 10 inches or get the out of my office!
He understood how Mario had become so successful and knew that if Sega was going to stand a fighting chance, they needed to implement a similar approach. Kalinske could tell the packing games Sega was providing with the Genesis were just not appealing to Western consumers. Desperate for any good ideas, Sega of Japan tasked their employees to submit ideas for a potential mascot that would compete against the wildly popular Mario. A young artist at Sega named Naoto Hoshima wanted to better understand what would appeal to Western consumers. So he actually took a flight to New York City to survey random people in Central Park about which designs of his appealed to them. It's reported he sketched 3 different characters on boards in Central Park and asked random people which they liked better. One sketch was of a dog, the second was a character he called Eggman, and the third was a hedgehog. To Oshima's surprise, New Yorkers really liked his hedgehog sketch over the others. Confident he had a winning idea, Oshima flew back to Tokyo and began perfecting his hedgehog character. One aspect he incorporated was he wanted it to be simple enough that kids could easily recreate it themselves in their own renditions. Sega's management looked at numerous submissions from their employees. As they began narrowing down designs, it appeared they were going to choose something really outside the norm. Designs they were considering included a rabbit, an armadillo, and even a Theodore Roosevelt lookalike? Eventually, Oshima's hedgehog was selected, and a team was assembled to begin designing a game around it. The game itself was designed to showcase the technical superiority of the Genesis. One way they did this was by giving the hedgehog character supersonic speed. Sega's new mascot was soon dubbed Sonic by the design team. The Defeat Mario team, as they were now being called, was able to develop a game demo rather quickly. This was due to the fact lead programmer Yuji Naka had already developed a demo game that incorporated the style of gameplay Sonic would use. All they had to do was replace the generic character with Sonic. The innovative design Naka and his team used incorporated a fast-moving character moving across the screen as a ball through a series of tubes. Naka had developed an algorithm that allowed sprites to move smoothly on a curve. It does this by using a dot matrix to pinpoint the sprite's location on screen. Hirokazu Yasuhara was the third member of the Defeat Mario team. His background consisted of Sega's hit game Altered Beast. 7 other Sega employees that consisted of 2 more programmers, 2 sound engineers, and 3 designers all joined the newly formed Defeat Mario team. When it came to the gameplay, this Defeat Mario mentality was persistent across the entire project. Everything Mario could do, they wanted Sonic to do even better. They wanted him to run faster, jump higher, and take more damage. But this proved more difficult than they imagined. Throughout development, countless problems popped up, including shaky animation, slow frame rates, character and screen flickering, you name it. Eventually, Naka developed an algorithm that fixed many of these issues, but ironically, the team discovered in the testing phase that many gamers thought the game was now too fast. After some discussions amongst team members, they ultimately slowed down the speed of the game. Even after slowing down the game's speed, it was still considered the fastest game on the market. Sonic moved so fast on screen, it seemed unreal. So unreal, in fact, Sega's marketing team was fearful people would question the legitimacy of the technology itself. In order to combat any doubt skeptics would have, they coined the term blast processing to describe what the Genesis hardware was capable of doing during gameplay to produce this effect.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do? And what if you don't have blast processing?
Critics ended up questioning this blast processing technology anyway. If you're wanting the truth about blast processing, here it is. Was blast processing, whatever it was, actually used in the Genesis hardware? No, it wasn't actually used, but it did actually exist in the Genesis hardware. Trying to keep this as simple as I can, which I know I'm not known for explaining technology in the most simple of terms. A game console designed for a cathode ray tube television, or a CRT TV, works by outputting the display in scan lines going across the screen, very much how analog broadcast signals used to work. Blast processing allows for the individual color palettes of each pixel to rapidly change as the image moves or is scanned, and the Genesis did technically have the hardware capable of doing this. Now, was blast processing ever used on any released titles? The answer is no. Sega used the term blast processing repeatedly in their advertising, without really explaining what it was or how it even worked. Is it fair to say they used false advertising when they did that? Well, they were promoting a product that did technically deliver an element that did do what they said it did. Now, that same element was never actually used in any of their game titles. False advertising? No, I guess not. Deceptive? Oh yeah, I'd agree to that. And the reason it was never utilized had to do with it being too complicated to actually implement. The mathematics required to properly take advantage of blast processing was so complicated that designers just didn't see the point of ever trying to use it. Well, what about Sonic the Hedgehog 2? That definitely used blast processing. No it didn't. It just didn't. There was one element of Sonic 2 that its programmers deliberately used to trick you into thinking it did. In this factory level, it appears Sonic is moving faster than the camera is scrolling. But that effect is so easy to fake. So, how do you fake it? The same way you would with a camera and an actor. You just program Sonic to be able to move beyond the rendered pixelated area. At the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in January of 1991, Sega introduced Sonic the Hedgehog to attendees there in Las Vegas. Even though Michael Katz officially left Sega in January of 91, Tom Kalinske had already been transitioning into his new role since the year before. By January of 91, Sega had already sold 1.5 million Genesis consoles and was 3 months away from releasing their own mobile gaming console to compete with the wildly successful Game Boy. Atari had already begun taking on Nintendo in the mobile market with their Lynx console. Yeah, by this point, Atari gave up naming their gaming systems after numbers and instead switched to a series of consoles named after cats. To be clear, this was Jack Tramiel's Atari Corporation, not Atari Games and Tengen, but I'll get into more detail with mobile gaming consoles in another episode. After getting mostly positive responses to their new Sonic the Hedgehog character, Sega decided to debut the new Sonic game on June 23, 1991, just weeks after the Summer CES in Chicago, and Sega of America wanted Sonic to replace Altered Beast as the Genesis pack-in game. The same CES would be where Nintendo would unexpectedly pull out of a deal with Sony in favor of Philips. Many agree that decision led to Sony entering the gaming market themselves with what would eventually be the Sony PlayStation in 1994. Philips would eventually release a bomb of a gaming console around this time. By the summer of 1991, Nintendo hadn't quite gone full Tony Montana, but they would soon realize that they were facing war on all fronts, and that they were not as invincible as they believed.
Say hello to my little friend!
While Sega and NEC were experiencing some moderate success with their 16-bit systems, Nintendo continued to dominate the market with a less advanced 8-bit system. Not wanting to repeat Atari's mistake with the 2600, Nintendo had already been hard at work with a 16-bit system of their own. Masayuki Uemura, who led the team that designed and developed the original Famicom, was tasked with this new 16-bit upgrade. Looking back at the original console wars of the 1970s and early 80s, Nintendo knew they didn't have to be first to market or even have the most advanced system to be successful. They just need to have loyal consumers. One major way they achieved this was by having a library of attractive games. They also offered up their console nearly at cost to the consumer, making the bulk of their profit by marking up the wide variety of games available. This had been a winning business model for them, but starting with the release of the Super Nintendo in North America, they were planting the seeds to what would eventually be their own demise. One aspect of this new 16-bit system would not incorporate what both Sega and Atari had incorporated, which was a backwards compatibility feature for their 8-bit game library. Nintendo's consumers, or the parents of Nintendo's consumers that is, were not happy with having to purchase an entirely new system that could not even replace the old one. Ironically, Sega had the upper hand with this because hardly anyone had owned a Master System. Nintendo had dominated the home gaming market during the 1980s, while Sega was barely able to get into arguably 10% of homes. For the 90% of consumers who had purchased a gaming system, the choice was between either buying an entirely new Super Nintendo for $200 or switching sides and buying a Sega Genesis for roughly the same price. By this point in 1991, Sega had the advantage of not only having the more powerful console, but a larger game library. And Nintendo was having trouble trying to convince consumers that they should continue investing in Nintendo. According to a 2016 interview published in Rolling Stone, Nintendo deliberately underclocked the speed of the Super Famicom's CPU. Doing this actually allowed for the CPU to instead focus on processing raw data on the game cartridge. Allowing the CPU to process raw data would become an advantage with 3D graphics in games that mostly use polygons instead of sprites, like Star Fox. Another method Nintendo used to maximize the look and feel of 3D graphics was by utilizing a feature they called Mode 7. Mode 7 was a part of the hardware that enabled the creation of a bitmap background, as well as allowing a graphic to smoothly rotate and alter its size, thereby allowing the graphic to appear either closer or further away. One upgrade feature Nintendo would use starting in 1993 would be an additional chip in certain game cartridges that they called the Super Effects chip. An unofficial nickname Nintendo used to reference it was the Mario chip, which stood for Mathematical, Argonaut, Rotation, and Input-Output. Boy, are you sure Gary Busey didn't name it?
Time out. To ensure measured energy on using time. The word team, T-E-A-M. Together, everyone achieves more.
The Argonaut part of the Mario chip was a reference to the developer that designed the chip and first utilized it in the game Star Fox. Argonaut Software was founded in 1982 by 16-year-old British teenager Jeremy San, who was self-taught in assembly language. San actually formed the company so he could provide security consulting to other companies at the time. In 1988, San welcomed fellow hacker Dylan Cuthbert on board. Like San, Cuthbert was only 16 years old when he joined Argonaut. In 1989, San and Cuthbert experimented with the Game Boy and ended up creating a way to display 3D graphics on the mobile game system. They ended up taking their discovery to the 1990 Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago and obviously got the attention of Nintendo executives. But instead of treating the young hackers the same way they treated other companies that had hacked the components of their systems, like Tengen, they instead invited the young entrepreneurs to Nintendo headquarters in Kyoto to discuss collaborating with them. After presenting the 3D engine to more executives at Nintendo, Cuthbert was hired and put on a team led by Yoshi Sakamoto, who is best known as the director of their highly successful Metroid series.
How do you feel about skin-tight blue jumpsuits?
Before working on Star Fox, Cuthbert would first develop the 3D Game Boy hit X, but I'm going to save that for a later episode on mobile game systems. During their initial meeting after CES, Sen and Cuthbert demonstrated the 3D capabilities of Nintendo's 8-bit hardware in what we'd call a hack game that they called NES Glider. After the impressive second demonstration, Nintendo thought it was time to have Argonaut check out a prototype that they'd been working on. This prototype was a 3D game that would eventually be released as Pilot Wings. It was Nintendo's first attempt at 3D gameplay. Nintendo wanted Argonaut to develop 3D capabilities for the not yet released Super Famicom console. It's reported that Argonaut hired some chip designers out of the University of Cambridge who, due to what Sand claims was a poorly documented 16-bit Nintendo prototype, had to reverse engineer the hardware just to integrate the new 3D chip. This chip is what Argonaut called Mario, and what Nintendo would eventually rename the Super Effects chip. In the end, Nintendo determined it was more cost efficient to place the chip on the individual game cartridges that required it, instead of providing it in the console itself. While Argonaut was working on the Mario chip, Dylan Cuthbert was working on the aforementioned Game Boy title simply called X. After completing X, Cuthbert was tasked with helping develop a 3D game for the recently released Super Famicom. In a past interview, Cuthbert himself says he didn't have any involvement with the Super Effects chip. He claims his role was with the development of the first game that would utilize it though. The development team tasked with creating this title was comprised of Cuthbert, Giles Goddard, and Krister Womble. The games Argonaut had developed and released for the Amiga during the 1980s all had a space theme with them, and Cuthbert was determined that this first 16-bit title of theirs keep the same format. While Nintendo was supportive of this, they weren't supportive, however, of the large free-roaming stages and complex controls that had become the norm for Argonaut's games. Nintendo wanted to keep it simple. The game that was ultimately produced was called Star Fox to North American gamers and Star Wing to European gamers. The reason for the slight title difference had to do with the 1983 Atari 2600 game, also called Star Fox, that had been released in Europe. To market Star Fox, Nintendo took a page out of Hudson Soft's playbook by hosting competitions in the US and Europe in 1993. Like Hudson Soft's care events held throughout the 80s and 90s, these Star Fox competitions were also successful and possibly a factor in Star Fox's and the Super Nintendo's success. By January of 1992, Sega had entered the year with a lot of momentum. Their Genesis console had already doubled in sales, selling 1.6 million units in 1991, totaling in over 3 million units sold in North America and over 800,000 units sold in Europe since its release in 1989. The replacement of Sonic the Hedgehog as the Genesis pack-in game was proving successful. History has shown, though, that it didn't matter if your console was first to market if your library wasn't up to par. Nintendo didn't have any issues with their game library, and Sega was making a conscious effort to create their own respectable game library themselves. Sega was becoming not just a thorn in Nintendo's side, but instead a legitimate threat to their dominance in the gaming market. Nintendo was about to realize that they were not as invincible as they previously thought. They were also about to discover that the bigger you are, the harder you fall. And if Nintendo was about to get pushed off a cliff, they were going to take Sega and any other competitor with them. 1992 would prove to be a pivotal year not just for Nintendo or the home console market, but for video games in general. In one of my earlier films, I covered Capcom and the numerous Street Fighter II games they released during the 90s. But in 1991, when Street Fighter II had become an overnight success, plans were already underway to port a version over to the new 16-bit home consoles that had just hit shelves. Over the years, Nintendo made a point to showcase their family-friendly image, as well as how their proprietary lockout chip was preventing pornographic games from being released. With Sega making an obvious graph role as an untapped teenage market, it made sense for them to release a version of Street Fighter II over to the Genesis, while Nintendo would obviously pass on the opportunity, especially since the first Street Fighter game had been ported over to the Master System. But oddly, that didn't happen. What must seem like some sort of Mandela effect of a false memory, there technically was no original Street Fighter II game ported over to the Genesis. What you might remember are later, upgrade versions of the game, the first of which was only released in September of 1993, a full 3 months after the PC Engine's version of the game was released, and more than a year after Nintendo released their first version of the game. But why did this happen? There are several reasons. One reason had to do with the contract Nintendo had arranged with Capcom to release a 16-bit version exclusively on the Super Nintendo console. Capcom had been one of Nintendo's top third-party developers with releases such as the Mega Man series. Capcom had hardly developed any games for Sega. Because of this, Sega was just unable to negotiate a better contract with them. When it came to actually playing Street Fighter II, Nintendo also offered up a better playing experience due in part to their 6-button controller, which was standard for the Super Nintendo. Sega's standard controller only had 3 buttons, and Sega would eventually have to develop a special 6-button controller just for Street Fighter II. Nintendo was not only able to secure a home-ported premiere of Street Fighter II, but was also able to release an additional Street Fighter II updated title, before Sega was even able to release their first Street Fighter II port. While Nintendo may have had the advantage with Street Fighter II, it wouldn't really matter, because Sega would have the preferred port to another, yet similar fighting game that would arguably be even more successful than Street Fighter II.
Mortal Kombat.
Mortal Kombat.
Mortal Kombat. Pull out their opponent's heart?
Decapitation.
Rip his head off just to see his spinal cord dangle in a pool of blood.
Mortal Kombat on Sega Genesis is the best video game ever.
I disagree. It's a very good game, but I think Donkey Kong is the best game ever.
Donkey Kong sucks.
Mortal Kombat's origins actually began in what is truly an ironic tale. In 1991, Midway Games was approached to create a video game adaptation to the upcoming 1992 film Universal Soldier, starring Jean-Claude Van Damme. Throughout the development process, the entire project shifted from Universal Soldier to something completely different, which was fine, because Midway ended up not even securing the rights to Universal Soldier or other similar Van Damme films anyway. Finding inspiration between Jean-Claude Van Damme and the recently successful Street Fighter II, Midway created a fighting game with a wide variety of characters, including Johnny Cage, who was intended to be a spoof of Van Damme himself. One of the most notable features Midway added that Street Fighter II obviously did not have was the ability to do a finishing move. Referred to in the game as a fatality, the player would hit a certain combination of buttons for any given fighter, who would then literally kill their opponent, oftentimes very violently. This feature did not go unnoticed by both players or their parents. In an attempt to ease concerns, Nintendo ended up releasing their version of the game omitting all the blood, while Sega kept the blood and gore and initiated their own game rating system to compensate. While this move seems like Sega was trying to appear responsible and acknowledge the extreme violence of not only Mortal Kombat, but other games such as Night Trap and Lethal Enforcers, Sega's rating system was strictly used by only them. And they weren't trying to monopolize their rating system either. They offered any other game distributor the opportunity to use their rating system. Nintendo objected because they didn't want Sega taking credit for developing a standard video game rating system. Plus, to be fair, Sega didn't really seek out outside opinions on what a standard system should even look like. Not that you necessarily need a lot of outside opinions, but Sega's rating system was a little confusing. Even id Software implemented a custom rating system for their Wolfenstein 3D series. The entire situation was a mess, and what ended up happening was a congressional hearing on violence in video games. Nintendo's Howard Lincoln and Sega's Bill White were just some from the video game industry who testified before Congress. Now, I'm not going to get into that whole mess, because I've already covered it in several different ways in other films. And while Mortal Kombat was far from the only game discussed in these hearings, the hearings themselves resulted in an official rating system for video games, which is still used today. The Mortal Kombat series would eventually get banned in several different countries, such as Germany and Australia, but over the past decade, many of those bans have been lifted. Something to point out that needs to be addressed is this idea of release dates for games. If you recall from my previous film, the exact release date for the original Super Mario Bros. Is highly contested. However, one game whose release date can't be contested is Sonic the Hedgehog 2. To capitalize on publicity and buzz, Sega began incorporating this idea of a release date. For the release of Sonic 2, Tom Kalinske wanted to capitalize as best he could by releasing the game on Tuesday, November 24th, 1992, the week of Thanksgiving and a few days before Black Friday. When he discussed this idea with Sega of Japan, they were, how would you put it, not thrilled? Sega of Japan was actually highly offended that their American counterpart would even think that a highly anticipated game like Sonic 2 would not only not be released in Japan prior to the United States, but on the same day even. There was a pride Sega of Japan had over Sega of America, and that had created a huge silent tension between the two companies. A silent tension that was now no longer silent. Kalinske and Sega of America were baffled at their Japanese counterparts' reactions and objections to the idea. To ease tensions between the two, Sega of Japan officially told Sega of America that releasing a product like Sonic 2 on both continents on the same day would be a logistical nightmare and just not logistically possible. In reality, this was just a handful of people at Sega of Japan trying to defuse what was obviously a very volatile situation. It was more than just a clash between two cultures. This was a civil war being fought during an already fierce console war against Nintendo. Kalinske knew that if the civil war continued inside Sega, it would be impossible to take down their chief competitor. Also wanting to ease tensions between his Japanese counterparts, he began negotiating with a handful of rational executives at Sega of Japan and eventually agreed that perhaps the logistics wouldn't allow for releasing the game on both continents on the same day. Kalinske proposed that perhaps Sega should release Sonic 2 in Japan a few days prior on November 21st, with the North American release still being on November 24th. This gesture was accepted at Sega of Japan, who agreed releasing Sonic 2 a few days prior would be more logistically doable. By the end of 1992, it was clear that Sega was giving Nintendo a real run for their money. Sales figures for this time have been contested, making it hard to accurately break down a clear winner by this point, but most sales figures, at the very least, indicate Sega held between 50 and 60% of the 16-bit market. But even if Sega held less than 50% of the market, they were making a huge impact on Nintendo and their business strategy and practices. With 1992 behind them, both companies entered 1993 optimistic and hungry for being the preferred home gaming platform. By 1993, Sega CD add-on for the Mega Drive was available in North America, Japan, and Europe. NEC's PC Engine had already incorporated CD technology with their CD add-on, and by 1991, Nintendo had been on the path to also join the CD Technology Club through a partnership with Sony. But that PlayStation project would end up getting dumped by Nintendo and instead completed by Sony alone. CD technology was supposed to enhance the game playing experience with full motion video. Compared to games today, these early CD games don't look like much, but they were pretty impressive for the time. One of the game titles Sega released that used this technology would complicate things for not only Sega, but anyone developing video games, and whose impact is still felt today. Night Trap had originated as a game idea for a third-generation console called Control Vision. This was a never-released console that changed ownership hands numerous times during its prototype phase. What sets Control Vision apart from others was that it uses VHS tapes alongside computer data as a means of interaction between the player and the game. And this wasn't a fringe project either. Nolan Bushnell and Steve Wozniak were among just some of those involved in its design and development. The concept of the game had been inspired by a somewhat successful 1985 play in Los Angeles called Scene of the Crime. What set the play apart was that the audience would choose the story's progression by moving to different rooms. Each room had different outcomes for the story. During the game's development, the creators referred to it with the same name as the play, and like the play, the game allowed for the player to decide what direction the story would go in by choosing different scenes throughout gameplay. During development, no one involved thought the content was any better or worse than your average low-budget horror movie for the time. And to be fair, if it was a standalone film, it wouldn't be any better or worse than any low-budget horror movie of the time. I mean, this was the era of Freddy and Jason. But this wasn't a movie in the traditional sense. It was a video game. After the Control Vision failed to launch, and 5 years after the game footage was filmed, its VHS prototype would land at someone's desk at Sega. Because most of the work had already been done, Scene of the Crime seemed like the perfect game to port over to the Sega CD. Keeping the same concept and using most of the same footage, Sega would release Night Trap in 1992. The plot revolves around the player being a member of the Sega Control Attack Team, or SCAT. Wait, SCAT? Anyway, the player's assignment is to review security footage taken from a mansion during a sleepover where 5 teenage girls have been reported missing. Wow, this is getting a little dark. I'm not going to dive deep into the game. I think I'll save that for its own episode later. Definitely an After Dark episode. By 1993, Sega really began to set itself apart from chief competitor Nintendo. They had gained a considerable share of the home console market, proving that Nintendo was in fact vulnerable. One way they did this successfully was instead of trying to steal away loyal fans of Nintendo, Sega had targeted an untapped market of teens and young adults. And they did this by offering unique, more mature games. But this successful formula was about to backfire, and soon lead to events that would have an effect on not just them, but all those involved in the video game industry. If Nintendo was the nerdy kid in class that reminded the teacher of the homework assignment, Sega was definitely the cool kid in class who was throwing spitballs in the back. For years, Nintendo, and the teacher for that matter, paid little attention to Sega. They just quietly removed the spitballs without saying anything. But now Sega was becoming a realistic threat to Nintendo and their bottom line. Think of it as the cool kid making valid arguments against the teacher, as well as getting higher grades than the nerd in the front of the class. Neither party were happy with Sega, and after a congressional staffer noticed his young son playing one of Sega's more mature games, they decided to take action against all video game developers. The teacher was about to punish the entire class for Sega turning in a perfect paper and defying classroom rules. In a previous episode on light gun technology, I somewhat covered this because the use of light guns was brought up in these congressional hearings. What I didn't go over in that episode was how games such as Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter II, and Night Trap were reviewed and criticized for their depictions of sex and violence. While Nintendo wasn't the main culprit, they still had the spotlight on them because of the violent games they had released themselves. Throughout the hearings, Sega and Nintendo failed to form any kind of alliance against these attacks made on both of them. Neither company walked away before getting bruised and battered, and not from attacks originating from Congress, but instead from each other.
Whoa, whoa. Wait a minute. Oh, wait a minute. You gotta understand, man. I never even saw these holes before. Henry, you gotta tell him you don't know me. We never met. Tell him.
I didn't think he'll listen, lad.
Look.
What ultimately ended up coming out of these hearings was the standardization of a video game rating system, much like how films are rated in many countries. To get Nintendo on board, Sega conceded their own, already implemented rating system and agreed to adopt whatever new system an independent third-party organization developed. In 1994, the Entertainment Software Ratings Board was formed and created a rating system that describes the age group a particular game is targeted for, as well as the content for that game. This system is still in use today. Like any controversial topic of this nature, there are criticisms of the ESRB, but I'm not going to dive into that here. By the time the ESRB had been created and the new ratings rolled out, the technology used in computers and gaming consoles was already rapidly improving. By 1994, Nintendo, Sega, and others were beginning to perfect the timeline used for developing and releasing gaming consoles. The mistakes Atari, Mattel, and Coleco all made in the early days of video games were becoming clear, and after successfully navigating through the 4th generation console wars, Nintendo and Sega were already preparing for an inevitable 5th generation console war. And like with every console war, a new contender was about to enter the ring. But this new contender wasn't just a nobody, they were a beast. A beast that Nintendo themselves had directly created just a few years prior, after success had gone to their heads, resulting in a business decision that they were about to regret.
You like movies about gladiators?